is the fourth installment of videos for Chapter 3. We're going to talk about cognitive development. So Piaget's theory is that there's mental structures that are built to help us adapt to the world. Individuals go through 4 stages of development, advancing their understanding of the world. So the process is there's schemes that are developed. So actions are mental representations that organize knowledge. So a behavioral scheme is physical activities, and a mental scheme is cognitive activities. And assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is using existing schemes to deal with new information. Accommodation is adjusting schemes to fit new information and experiences. So these assimilation and accommodation kind of are impact one another. So think about a child that sees a dog, and they're taught that that's a dog. So it's this 4-legged furry thing, okay? But so they see this dog and they think, okay, that's a dog. I'm taught that it's a dog. So dog and cat are usually, I mean, these are very simple ideas, and they may be given. I know when I was a new mom, I actually bought flashcards for my kids, and I had this dog, and it had dog under it. So I would say dog. We had a dog. I would show them a dog, and I would show them a picture of a dog. So all these things they know this is a dog. But we drive by, let's say, and see a deer, and child says dog. No, that's not a dog. Why would they think that's a dog? Because this deer has 4 legs, and it's also furry, and it doesn't look like a human. Doesn't look like, mommy or daddy. It looks like the dog. So they use what they already know to take this new thing, this new experience. So they see this deer and they call it a dog. So to them, it's a dog because that's what they know. However, we're like, no, that's a deer. So then they learn something else new, and they have to adjust their scheme, right? So they think, okay, well, a dog, let's say this was a buck, right? So it's a deer, but it has the antlers. So we say, well, no, that's a deer. So this has, you see the antlers, and you see this and that. So the baby's like, okay, a dog doesn't have antlers. So they're accommodating, they're adjusting their schemes to fit new experiences with the information. So they take the things that they already know and they adjust it. Okay, so it's not that thing. So a dog is not this thing. And this new thing, we thought was a dog, but it's not a dog. Okay, so that's how, kind of the process of assimilation and accommodation. But it's very much more complicated than just these things, because you have to consider too, this child is also learning people, right? And I'm mama, but this other person is not mama. This other person is dada, right? So if a child is confined to only seeing mother and father, mama and dada, what do you think they're going to call some other guy that they see when they come in? They're going to call that guy dada too, probably. They haven't learned the different names for everybody, so they might call this person dada. Or if this person comes in and that's their grandpa, and you teach them that's grandpa, and grandpa's older and grandpa has a beard, then he sees another guy with a beard and he might call him grandpa. Okay? So hope that makes sense. This is kind of how a child like perceives the world. So organization is grouping of isolated behaviors and thoughts into a higher order system. Equilibration mechanism by which children shift from one stage of thought to the next. Sensory motor stage, birth to 2 years. This is infants construct an understanding of the world by coordinating sensory experiences with physical motor actions. Now, object permanence, that's one that is a big idea. This is something that if you have someone who has an infant, if you have a friend who has an infant, or if you have a brother or sister that's an infant, this is kind of a fun thing you can do at home, and that's object permanence is understanding that objects continue to exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, or touched. So take an object, take a cloth, and cover that object with the cloth and see if that child tries to find it. See if that child knows where this is. And if they understand that that object still exists, they'll likely grab the object if they're interested in the object. But if they're not interested in the object, they might not anyway. So make sure they're interested in it before you try to do that. So there's also something called A not B error, and that's a tendency of infants to reach where the object was located earlier rather than the object was last hidden. And I have a video that I'll show. I'll have to cut it off short because it goes further into detail about Piaget stages, but older infants are less likely to make the A not B error because their concept of object permanence is more complete. There's an approach that some people think of called the core knowledge approach. It states that infants are born with domain-specific innate knowledge systems. So kind of like this knowledge is inborn rather than an experience. Okay, so object permanence and the A not B error. So this won't last the whole 6 minutes because we're starting at the very beginning.
New babies aren't quite sure what happens to objects when they leave their sight. Sky's mom keeps disappearing and reappearing. No wonder peekaboo is so much fun. During their first year, however, infants will learn an important concept: object permanence. Everything has a life of its own, even if it is out of sight.
At Maya's age, babies know to look for the object, but they might not have everything else straight. 10-month-old Simon is about to make a classic mistake. Although he watched us place the toy plane under the white cloth, he'll look for it where he last found it, not where he watched us hide it.
So this kid saw them hide it under the white cloth, but it was originally under the other cloth, so he goes back to the other cloth to pick it up, right? So if some infants, like they're not connecting that, oh, it must be there because this is where they originally found it, so they think it has to be there, right? So they don't have that concept solidified of object permanence, where no, this object is under this cloth because that's where you actually hid it this time. So operant conditioning: if an infant's behavior is followed by a rewarding stimulus, the behavior is likely to occur. That's what people who ascribe to operant conditioning. Attention, focusing of mental resources on select information. Habituation and dishabituation closely linked. And joint attention, so individuals focus on the same object or event. The ability to track one's behavior and one person's directing another's attention. So joint attention and social referencing, I wanted to point that out in this video.
Why is joint attention so important? Responding to joint attention is when your child follows your lead and attends to the same thing as you do. For example, if you say, "Look," and point to a ball, your child should look in the direction you're pointing. This is how your child demonstrates joint attention. Joint attention allows your child to learn from others and to share enjoyment with others. Initiating joint attention is your child's ability to use their gaze, gestures, pointing, sounds, and words to draw your attention to an object or event. Your child will look at the object of interest and then back at you to learn and share enjoyment. An example is when your child looks up to the sky and points to an airplane, and then looks back at you and back to the airplane passing by. If your child looks at you to share enjoyment or to see if you are watching them, this is called social referencing. Joint attention is an important milestone for social development as your child is showing interest in not only objects, but people and their reactions. Children with autism spectrum disorder are delayed in displaying joint attention. At 2 months of age, infants display joint attention by taking turns exchanging looks, noises, and mouth movements. At 6 months, children look in the same direction as others and follow your gaze. At 8 months, infants demonstrate pointing. At 9 months, infants demonstrate gestures and social referencing. Your 1-year-old child will point intentionally to show interest. At 12 to 14 months, your child will start to direct your attention by pointing and then look back at you.
Now think about how important joint attention and social referencing are for development. What would you do if you didn't really learn from others? So I would not be teaching you. You would not be learning from family. You'd be picking everything up on your own. That's not how life works. You learn from all others around you, your siblings, aunts and uncles, cousins, other family members, friends, peers, teachers, members of the community, people that you know, just neighbors, people in the store, celebrities. There's just so many different ways that you learn from other people. So learning social referencing, especially when I think about social referencing, I consider cultural norms. So a child that looks back at me, who points to something, or something happens and then looks at me, is not just looking at me because they don't know what to do, but they're also looking at me to see what the appropriate way is to respond. So if something sad happens and they see me crying, they realize this is different than what it was a second ago, right? This is not a smiling, happy, laughy thing, right? This is a sad, crying thing. So, and that's important for their social development, for them to grow up with a healthy, well-rounded sense of social norms and how to act socially, how to be empathetic, things like that. Imitation, so they imitate abilities as imitative abilities as biologically based. Deferred imitation occurs after a delay of hours or days. Memory involves retention of information over time, so implicit is without conscious recollection, but explicit is conscious remembering of facts and experiences. So think about, though, childhood amnesia. Most adults can remember very little, if anything, from the first 3 years of their life. Can you remember anything from when you were an infant? Anything at all? I know I don't really remember anything from when I was an infant, and there are certain things that I think that I remember, but then somebody told me these stories. So am I remembering them because that's how they were, or am I remembering this story that was told to me, right? So there is just so much going on in that span of time of learning and developing. Like, childhood amnesia is common. We don't really remember that much from when we're that age. Now, I thought this was an interesting video just to explain too. This is the Rovee Collier studies.
Some recent experiments with 3-month-olds have revealed a surprisingly complex mind already at work.
I think that most people who work with human adults think that babies are like rats until they're 8 or 9 months of age. And I think that what we've shown is that babies are very human from the moment they're born. Say hi, I'm Peggy. I talked to you on the phone.
Infancy researcher Carolyn Rovee Collier and assistant Peggy Borsa make a house call.
Yes, I'm Carolyn Rovee Collier.
John B. Watson's work helped shape the attitudes of an earlier generation. This new research helps document a new vision of the infant.
We're going to be teaching you a game, Martin. Yes, he says. Well, it's one of these things. You know, you can lead a baby to a mobile, but you can't make him want to play if he doesn't want to. Give me something to do down here. What do you say?
Martin's foot is attached by a ribbon to a separate stand, not to the mobile itself. Peggy counts his kicks. This gives a comparison for the experiment which follows.
How you doing, good guy, huh? Kind of boring down there. Nothing going on.
Peggy connects the ribbon to the mobile.
I get some action.
Now Martin can see and hear the consequences of his actions. His rate of kicking doubles. The infant is now an active player in his world. But that's only one part of what these experiments reveal. Next, it was on to visit Michael, one of a pair of twins whose parents stayed around for Rovee Collier's explanations.
How do you want to be put in it? Oh, head on the other way.
Michael explores the ribbon, although it is not yet attached to the blocks. But still, he gives it what Carolyn Rovee Collier calls the good old college try.
He's so active that it's going to be difficult to show that he's learned. Although, who knows? He likes to make the ribbon go up. He's picked up on that.
3-month-olds cannot crawl or walk, and research has shown some parents, especially fathers, think infants only become people when they begin to speak. But sometimes, actions speak louder than words.
Seems to be getting to the point that he's only moving the foot that makes the mobile work. So he's just waving that foot like a flag. This child is controlling this visual spectacle to make happen what he wants to, what he enjoys.
From birth, there were the reflexes and perceptual preferences. Now the child is learning to construct and repeat activities which please him.
So you saw that at first when they put Martin in the crib and they hooked that up, he was kind of surprised at first when the mobile started moving, but later on he kind of got the hang of things, and when they brought him back, he was able to move just mostly the one leg, right? Because that was a choice that he made because of something he wanted to happen. So he was motivated by this action that he wanted of this mobile to start moving. So concept formation and categorization. Concepts are cognitive groupings of similar object, events, people, or ideas. There's perceptual categorization, categorization based on similar perceptual features of objects. And I think in your book it had airplane and animal figurines that were in the shapes, in certain shapes like airplanes. And so the perceptual would be more like the shape of it, or like the colors, like red and blue objects. And the conceptual categorization, though, is what is that thing? That's an airplane and that's a bird, right? So there's the difference between the two. Language development. So this is a really important consideration for especially like humans, right? The form of communication that is spoken, written, or signed based on systems of symbols. So what does A represent and B represent? What sound does that make, right? So what does this word mean? What does this word represent? So it consists of words used by a community and the rules of varying and rules for varying and combining them. So different cultures have different ways to say things. You can notice if you are in a foreign language, that if you take a phrase that is in English and try to interpret it in another language, sometimes it doesn't have a direct interpretation, and sometimes if you take a phrase from like Spanish to try to interpret it in English, it's like we don't really say it that way. So there's differences in these cultures, right? Of the way this these phrases, what they mean, and why we use them, and things like that. Um, Infinite generativity is the ability to produce an endless number of meaningful sentences using the finite set of words and rules. So babbling and gestures. Crying, so different cries mean different things. Remember that. Cooing, babbling, showing and pointing, recognizing language sounds. So phonemes, basic sound units of language, citizens of the world. So infants can distinguish sound changes no matter what language the symbols come from. Okay. So I want to show you videos of cooing versus babbling. This is cooing. You can see some of the coos were a lot more like excited and happy and more of happy emotion versus the other ones that started to get a little bit upset about something. And this would be babbling. So you see the difference between the cooing and the babbling. This is more like just making the sound, and this is trying to form this word, right? So trying to learn how to use their mouth in a way that makes words like they see people around them making. So first words, an infant's receptive vocabulary considerably exceeds spoken vocabulary. So they might be able to understand things, but they can't necessarily make those words themselves at that time. So receptive vocabulary, the word the child understands. Spoken is the word the child uses. Vocabulary spurt is a rapid increase in vocabulary. And here's the variation in language milestones. So you can see the first words are around between like 9, 10 or so months up to 18 months when a baby might say their first words. The vocabulary spurt comes about probably 13 months up to 2 years of age, and you'll see this huge increase once they are able to make these noises, make these sounds, and they know this before they can write, before they can read, but they're able to make these sounds that where they can communicate, and then they start learning because their mouth is able to make these words. They start learning how to make all kinds of words. So 2-word utterances to convey meaning. Child relies on gesture, tone, and context. Telegraphic speech, use of short and precise words without grammatical markers. So something that a child might say is like drink. They might just say drink. They might say milk drink or something like that. Or they might say like bad doggy if the dog does something they don't want him to, things like that. Like we used to have dogs when the boys were little, and if the dog would get those biter biscuits that I mentioned before, like because kids are really short and the dogs are, I mean, that's access to food right there. So because a kid will literally lay anything they're eating anywhere in the house that they have access to. So if they lay it on the table, dog can reach up and get it off the table. If it's a short table. They might even lay it on the floor, which you don't want to give it. Obviously, you're like, I don't want you to eat it anyway. The dog grabs it. The dog might take it right out of the kid's hands. That happened several times. So the kid might say, "Bad doggy." So, but they basically a couple words at a time they would put together, but not complete sentences. So here's a video of an interview with a 2-year-old that I thought was pretty cute.
What's your name?
D.
How old are you?
2.
What does your dad do for a living?
Dada. Dada, you dada. New dada.
What's your favorite snack?
Taki. Taki cookie.
Sit down.
Tea.
Do you like being at home all day with your mom?
Mommy, yeah. 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 Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a girlfriend?
The clever. The honey. I see her pie.
How old is your girlfriend?
2.
Okay. I hear your mom does figure competitions. Can I see your muscles?
Yeah. Mushroom.
What's your favorite color?
Boo.
But that's yellow.
Yo, yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Can you sing me a song?
Tickle. Tickle, tickle, da. How is it?
Beautiful. That was beautiful. Thank you. What's your favorite movie?
Muy. Yeah, muy.
What's your favorite movie?
What car?
What's your favorite fruit?
Pew, pew, no.
Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Fly.
Do you like the snow?
No. No.
Why not?
Cool. Ooh, yeah.
Well, what do you do when it's hot outside?
Awesome. I don't know.
Do you want to say bye?
Bye. Bye. Bye.
So you saw that he actually did a really good job answering questions. Some of the interpretations may or may not have been correct, but I thought the interpretations were pretty good for what, the sounds. But you could tell he was trying to speak, like when he was singing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. We know the words to that, so we know the things he's trying to say, so that was a little easier to see. He's making noises that sound like these words, but it's not necessarily that he has the grasp of saying these words. Like he hasn't physically been able to say the words really clearly yet. Biological influence on language. There's Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is the area in the brain's left frontal lobe. that is associated with speech production. Okay, that's important to remember. You will probably talk about Broca's area in several classes if you take several psychology classes. Um, Wernicke's area is the area in the brain's left hemisphere that is involved in language comprehension. So being able to speak and being able to comprehend are different. Remember when we talked about the different speech, like the vocabulary the child can understand, the receptive vocabulary, and then their spoken vocabulary, the type of language the child can actually produce. So Chomsky, this is something that not necessarily is super important to the way we do things now, or the way we think of things now, but this is something that we have to learn. So Chomsky came up with the term language acquisition device. Is a term that describes a biological endowment enabling the child to detect features and rules of language, including phonology, syntax, and semantics. So there's not really, we don't have this language acquisition device specifically in the brain. You know, there's different areas, right? So we already talked about Broca's area and Wernicke's area and stuff. There's environmental influences on language. So the behaviorist view of language learning has several problems. It does not explain how people create novel sentences. So why do people come up with these sentences? Children learn the syntax of their native language even if they are not reinforced for doing that. Early speech input and poverty have effects on children's language skills. Vocabulary development is linked to a family's socioeconomic status and type of talk that parents direct to their children. So think about why would socioeconomic status impact this? Well, it's likely that the family with higher SES may have more college education or better education. So they probably have better vocabulary. They can speak in better sentences with more grammatically correct sentences than someone with lower SES that may have not finished school or may not be around as much. There's also people with higher SES may pay for their kids to go to preschool early, very early. Some preschools or child care programs, that's a very important one to consider, may have better language teaching abilities than someone whose kid is just set in front of a TV and the non-educational shows are playing, things like that. So it's important to think about stuff about how socioeconomic status actually impacts a child's development, not even just because of nutrition, but in many other ways. Child-directed speech. Now, that's language spoken in a higher pitch than normal, using simple words and sentences. So this is something that I still speak to with my dogs. So I might say, "Hi, baby. Hi, how are you, baby? Who's my baby?" And you can hear my dogs are actually walking to me right now. So, speaking to a child like this is kind of, this is not something as a new parent that I knew for my child would be good. This would be, higher pitch, and they could hear it, they could, it comforts them. This is not something that I knew. This is something that I just did, right? Because I did not go to college before I had my children. But I still spoke to my children with this higher pitched, sweet voice as just their mother. Children's experiences influence language acquisition. Language also has strong biological foundations, and the interactionist view emphasizes both biology and experience. Those both contribute to language development. And think about how important that is. If, there has been, and I think if anybody has had Probably Dr. Jan might have talked about it in early psych classes, but um, so a child with brain damage, they're to maybe different areas of the brain, different other areas might take over and develop those abilities still. Instead, it just may not be as efficient as it would have been had there not been brain damage. But so there's biological foundations because you have these areas of the brain that are, you know, focused more on language comprehension, language um, usage, and things like that. But there's also environmental influences due to the type of talk the child hears in the home. Um, if if it's very bad grammar, bad um, or not talking enough, or yelling, or things like that, where uh, there's just all this tension and there's not as much talking and conversation, then the child may not develop that language ability as well as a child that is put in, who has a home where they um, talk to this child and have child directed speech. They talk to each other or teach this child words and things like that, work with the children. So you can see why the upbringing of the child, it's not just about at this certain point when they're by the time they can get to school, they've already got all this learning that has taken place. So at the beginning of school, these kids start out with a certain amount of learning that has already happened, and this development that has already happened that can't be changed necessarily uh, by going to school. Improvements can still be made, but at a certain point, these um, these experiences that this child has had in their home uh, is very important for their growth and development. So I hope that this was a very helpful um, video for cognitive development for you guys. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please let me know. That concludes Chapter 3, and I'm going to move on to Chapter 4, which is socio-emotional development in infants.